My daughter stood at the far end of the conference table with her arms crossed, and she did not even look at me when she said it. She said, "Dad, just so you know, Margaret left everything to me. You are not getting a single dollar." She said it the way you might tell someone the weather. Flat, certain. Like the matter had already been decided long before any of us sat down in that room. I remember looking at my hand. I had carpenter's hands, rough at the knuckles, with a scar along my left thumb from a table saw accident in 1987. Margaret used to trace that scar with her finger when we were young. She used to say it made me look distinguished. I had not thought about that in years. The lawyer, a man named Gerald Hofstede, cleared his throat and said nothing. He just shuffled his papers and waited. And I sat there in that chair thinking about how I had driven 4 hours from Knoxville to Nashville in the rain to be in this room, and whether any of it mattered at all. My name is Robert. I am 63 years old. I was married to Margaret for 19 years, and we raised one daughter together, a girl we named Claire. I am going to tell you what happened in that conference room and everything that led up to it. But to understand any of it, you have to understand what Margaret and I were before we became what we eventually turned into. I met Margaret at a job site. I was 31 years old and running a small residential construction crew in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. She was an architect working for a firm out of Nashville, and she had been sent to do an inspection on a property we were building. She wore a yellow hard hat that was slightly too big for her head, and she carried a clipboard and she walked through that framed house like she owned it, pointing out measurements that were off by fractions of an inch. Most contractors would have argued. I just pulled out my notebook and wrote everything down. She noticed that. She told me later it was the first thing she liked about me, that I listened. We dated for 2 years, and then we got married in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard, in Brentwood. Her family had money. Her father was a developer. Her mother had come from old Nashville money, the kind that does not talk about itself. I was the working man who had married above his station, and her father made sure I understood that, not cruelly, but clearly. He shook my hand at the reception and said, "You seem like a solid man, Robert. Just make sure you stay that way." I never forgot it. For a while, we were good. Margaret advanced quickly in her firm and eventually made partner. I built my construction business into something real. 15 employees at our peak. Solid reputation throughout Middle Tennessee. We bought a house in Franklin. We had Claire, who came into the world loud and red-faced and immediately the center of everything. We were a family. We had the life that you work for. But something happens when two driven people are both building things at the same time. You get parallel. You are moving in the same direction but on separate tracks. And you tell yourself, that is fine because at least you are going the same way. Then one morning you wake up and you realize the tracks have been diverging for years, and the distance between them is now so wide that you cannot even see each other clearly anymore. We separated when Claire was 14. The divorce was finalized 2 years later. It was not dramatic. There was no affair, no explosion, no single moment of rupture. There was just the accumulated weight of two people who had slowly become strangers inside the same house. We split things fairly. Margaret kept the Franklin house. I moved into a smaller place in Knoxville where I had expanded the business. We shared custody of Claire, and for a few years, that arrangement worked about as well as those arrangements ever work. Claire was 17 when she started pulling away from me. I want to be careful about how I say this because she was a teenager, and pulling away from parents is what teenagers do, and I do not want to paint her as a villain for things that were simply the nature of that age. But there was something specific happening that went beyond normal adolescence. The more Margaret's career grew, and it grew considerably in those years, the more Claire aligned herself with her mother's world. The architecture, the money, the social circles. And the more she did that, the more I became something slightly embarrassing. The contractor father. The working man. She never said it outright. She was too smart for that. But I felt it in the way she talked about my house versus her mother's house. The way she described my job to her friends. Once, when she was 22, I overheard her on the phone say that her father worked in construction in a tone that made it sound like something to be apologized for. I had built that business from nothing. I had crews who had worked for me for 15 years. I had houses standing all across 3 counties that would outlast me by a century. But to my daughter, I worked in construction. Margaret and I were not enemies after the divorce. We were cordial. We handled Claire's events together without incident. We were adults, but we did not confide in each other, and we did not keep each other close. So when Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at age 58, I found out from Claire, not from Margaret herself, and I found out 3 weeks after the diagnosis. I called Margaret that night. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was the same as it always was, measured and precise, and she said, "I didn't want to make it a production, Robert." I told her I was sorry. I told her if she needed anything, I was there. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know you are." That was all. Over the following 18 months, Margaret fought hard. Surgery, chemotherapy, a clinical trial program at Vanderbilt. Claire moved back to Nashville to be close to her, and I drove down when I could, which was not as often as I should have. The business was going through a difficult stretch. I had a project in serious trouble, a commercial build that had run into foundation issues, and I was spending 60-hour weeks trying to keep it from collapsing into litigation. I told myself Margaret had Claire. I told myself I would go more when things settled down. I told myself a lot of things that I am not proud of now. What I did not know, during those 18 months, was that Margaret and I were still talking to each other. Not by phone, by letter. It started when I sent her a card after the diagnosis. A simple card, nothing elegant, just something I found at a Walgreens on my lunch break with a picture of a mountain on the front. I wrote 3 sentences inside it. I said I remembered that she had once told me the mountains made her feel like problems were the right size. I said I hoped she found that feeling again. I signed it Robert. She wrote back. A real letter, 2 pages, handwritten. She talked about her garden. She talked about a book she was reading. She mentioned, briefly, that she was more frightened than she let anyone see. That was all. But she wrote back. We wrote to each other for 14 months. I did not tell Claire. I do not believe Margaret told her either. The letters were not romantic. They were not the letters of 2 people rekindling anything. They were the letters of 2 people who had known each other for a very long time, who had made each other and also hurt each other, and who had found, at this late hour, a way to simply be honest. She told me things she could not tell her colleagues or her friends or even Claire, because those people needed her to be strong, and I did not need that from her. I had already seen her in every version she had. I needed nothing from her except what she was willing to give. She wrote once, in February of the last year, about Claire. She said she worried about what she had built in Claire. She said she had given her daughter everything, every advantage, every door opened, every bill paid without hesitation, and she wondered now whether she had also given her a belief that the world was obligated to provide. She said she had watched Claire become someone who measured people by what they could offer. She said it kept her up at night. I read that letter 4 times. I wrote back and told her that Claire was still young enough to change. I believed it when I wrote it. I am not sure I believe it now. Margaret died on a Tuesday in October. Claire called me at 6 in the morning. Her voice was flat, controlled, the same way her mother's voice was controlled, and she told me the time of death and the name of the funeral home, and said she would send me the service details by email. I drove to Nashville that afternoon. I sat in the back of the church at the memorial service 3 days later, and I watched my daughter stand at the podium and speak about her mother with a composure that looked, from the outside, like grace. I knew, having read those letters, that it was armor. The meeting with the estate attorney was scheduled for 2 weeks after the service. Gerald Hofstede, of Hofstede and Crane, a firm Margaret had worked with professionally for years. Claire and I were the only 2 named in the notification. I drove down on a gray November morning. The office was in a restored Victorian building near Vanderbilt, the kind of place that signals old money and discretion. Claire was already in the waiting room when I arrived. She stood when she saw me, and that was when she told me, "Dad, just so you know, Margaret left everything to me. You are not getting a single dollar." I asked her how she knew that. She said, "Because Mom and I talked about it, because you were barely there, because you sent a card, Robert." She only called me Robert when she wanted to make sure I understood she was not speaking to me as a daughter. "You sent a card while I was driving her to chemo every week. You get nothing. I'm just telling you, so you're not embarrassed in there." I thought about the 14 months of letters sitting in a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet in Knoxville. I thought about the mountain card from Walgreens. I thought about Margaret writing, in her careful architect's handwriting, about fear and gardens and what she had gotten wrong. I did not say any of that. I said, "Okay, Claire," and I went inside. Gerald Hofstede was a lean man in his late 50s with reading glasses he wore on a cord around his neck. He had the settled manner of someone who had seen every variety of human behavior that grief and money together could produce, and who had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He shook both our hands and offered water and arranged his documents with the quiet efficiency of a man who takes his work seriously. Claire sat with her hands folded on the table, and her expression arranged into something that was meant to project certainty. She had inherited her mother's posture. Perfect spine, shoulders squared. I had seen that posture in 1,000 moments of her life. School plays and arguments, and the morning she left for college. It still, even now, after everything, made something in my chest tighten. Gerald began with the estate overview. Margaret had done well. Between the value of the Franklin house, her partnership equity in the architecture firm, her investments in liquid assets, and a life insurance policy, the total estate was valued at approximately $4.2 million. Claire's chin lifted slightly when the number was confirmed. She had done the math already. She had been doing the math for months. Then Gerald put on his reading glasses, and he said he needed to read the full text of the specific bequest clauses, because Margaret had given explicit instructions that they be read verbatim. He read the first section. The Franklin house and its contents went to Claire as primary residence. The majority of the investment portfolio went to Claire. The firm partnership stake went to Claire, with a structured buyout agreement already arranged with the other partners. Claire did not move. She was keeping still the way a person keeps still when they are trying not to show how relieved they are. Then Gerald turned a page. He said that Margaret had established a separate instrument, not a bequest within the will, but a trust with its own terms, its own timeline, and its own trustee. The trust had been created 14 months before Margaret's death. It had been funded in monthly increments over the course of that same 14 months. The total value of the trust at the time of Margaret's death was $380,000. The trust had one beneficiary. Gerald looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Robert, you are named as the sole beneficiary of the Margaret Claire Whitfield Living Trust." The room was very quiet. Claire said, "What?" Gerald said he would continue with the terms. The trust was structured with a specific distribution schedule, assets released over 5 years to provide sustained support rather than a single payment. There was also a personal letter attached to the trust documentation, authored by Margaret, which under the terms of the instrument was to be read aloud to both parties at the time of distribution. Claire said, "That is not right. That is not what she told me." Gerald said, gently and without any drama, that the trust documents were executed and notarized, and that they reflected Margaret's stated intentions. Then he picked up the letter. "I want to tell you what was in that letter, but I want to tell it carefully because it was not written for the world. It was written for me, and it was written for Claire, and it was written, I think, most of all by a woman trying to do something right at the end that she had not quite managed to do in the middle. Margaret wrote that she knew how this moment would look. She knew Claire would feel betrayed. She said that was not the intention, but she also said she was done making her choices based on how they would be received. She had spent 30 years making choices based on how they would be received. She was done. She wrote that Robert, meaning me, had shown up for her in a way that was invisible to everyone else, and that invisible did not mean absent. She wrote that there is a kind of presence that is not witnessed, and not applauded, and not posted anywhere, and she had spent most of her life not valuing that kind of presence, and she was correcting that now. She wrote to Claire directly. She said, "I gave you everything I had to give, and I would do it again, but I gave you too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. I taught you that value is visible. I taught you to count what can be counted. I did not teach you to honor what cannot. I am trying to teach it now, at the only moment I have left to teach it." She wrote one more thing. She wrote that the money in the trust was not a reward for Robert. It was a correction. She said she had let too many years pass without acknowledging what he had put into their family, into their daughter, into the decades of a life they had built together. And the money was the only language the law understood. She said she was sorry it had come to this language. She would have preferred another one, but she used what she had. Gerald folded the letter. Claire did not cry. She sat very still and looked at a point somewhere past my left shoulder, and she did not say anything for a long time. I watched my daughter in that silence, and I thought about what Margaret had written, about what she had built in her. I thought about how you can love someone completely and still get them wrong. I thought about how Margaret had known it and carried it and finally said it when she could not be argued with anymore. I did not feel like I had won anything. I want to be clear about that. The $380,000 is real and it will matter. It means I can retire without fear. It means the bad quarter I had last year will not follow me into old age. That matters, and I am not going to pretend it does not. But I did not sit in that conference room feeling triumphant. I sat there feeling the weight of 14 months of letters. I sat there feeling the weight of 19 years. I sat there feeling the specific grief of a man who had been known, truly known, by someone, and had to wait until she was gone to find out how much. I drove home in the rain, same as I had come. There is a thing that happens when you are in the construction trade long enough. You learn that the parts of a building no one ever sees are the parts that determine whether it stands. The footings, the framing, the load-bearing structure behind the drywall. Nobody photographs the footings. Nobody walks through a house and says, "Look at the quality of that framing." They see the countertops and the light fixtures and the paint colors. But strip all of that away, and what you have left is the thing that actually holds. I spent a lot of my life being the footings. That is not a complaint. I chose the work. I showed up for it because it was mine to do. But there is something it does to a person, year after year, to do the invisible work. To be the one who holds things up without acknowledgement. You start to wonder whether holding things up is enough, whether being necessary and being valued are the same thing. They are not the same thing. It takes a long time to learn that, and longer still, to make peace with it. Margaret knew. She knew because she had finally stopped long enough to look at what was actually holding. Claire called me 3 weeks after that meeting. It was a Sunday evening, and I was on my back porch watching the ridgeline go dark, the way it does in November in East Tennessee when the sun drops behind the hills and the light turns the color of iron. She called and I answered. She did not apologize. I did not expect her to. What she said was, "I read the letter again." That was all. Just that she had read it again. I said, "Yeah." She said, "She was hard on me." I said, "She was honest with you. She didn't have time to be anything else." There was quiet on the line. I could hear her breathing. I thought about the girl who had come home from school every day and dropped her backpack at the door and shouted, "Dad," into the house just to check. Not because she needed anything, just to confirm I was there. She had done that until she was 12. I had forgotten that until just now. I said, "You can be hard to be honest with, Claire. You always have been." She loved you too much to say it while she was here. She did not respond to that. But she stayed on the line. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. About my backyard, about a plumbing issue she was having in the Franklin house now that it was hers, about the first cold front coming through. Small things. The kind of things that people say when they are figuring out whether they still have a language in common. We might. I do not know yet. I am 63 years old, and I have learned to stop making predictions. What I know is this. Margaret Whitfield was a complicated woman who spent most of her life moving very fast in a forward direction, and who found, at the end, that some things require you to stop and turn around and look at what you left behind. She turned around. She looked. She did what she could with the time she had. I keep the letters in the shoebox on the top shelf of the closet. I have not reread them since the meeting. I will someday, when I am ready. There are things in them that belong to her, and I am not ready to make them only mine. But they are there, and I know they are there. And on the nights when the house is quiet and I am sitting with a cup of coffee watching the dark, I can feel the weight of them above me. Not a heavy weight, just a present one, she wrote, in the last letter she ever sent me, 6 weeks before she died. I think the thing I regret most is not the mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. I think what I regret is the speed. I moved so fast for so long. I wonder what I would have seen if I had moved slower. I did not know when I read it that it would be the last one. I wrote back. The letter came back unopened. By then she was in the hospital and could not receive it, but I wrote it. I told her what I thought she would have seen. I told her she would have seen the same things she saw anyway, because she was Margaret, and she was constitutionally incapable of missing anything important. She would have seen them sooner, maybe, with less noise around them. But she would have seen them. She always did, in the end. I am a man who builds things. I have spent 40 years learning how to read the land before you put anything on it. You cannot build on ground you do not understand. You have to know what is underneath. You have to know what it can bear and what it cannot, where the water moves and where the weight will settle. Most people who hire a builder never think about this. They think about the house. They do not think about the ground. Margaret thought about the ground at the end. She looked down and she saw what was there and she made her accounting. I think that is enough. For most people, it is more than they manage. The first check from the trust arrived in January. Gerald Hofstede's office sent it by certified mail with a cover letter that was professional and brief. I held it for a while before I deposited it. Not because I was uncertain about taking it, because I was trying to feel what it actually was. Margaret's handwriting was not on it. There was nothing of her in the paper itself, but she had put it in motion. She had set it going, months before she left, in the quiet of her office or her kitchen or wherever she sat when she did the thing that nobody witnessed. I deposited it on a Wednesday afternoon at a branch in downtown Knoxville. The teller was a young woman who stamped the deposit slip and handed it back with a routine smile. She had no idea what the check was. She had no idea what any of it was. That felt right to me. That felt like the correct proportion of things. I drove home and I put the deposit slip in the kitchen drawer and I made dinner, and I ate alone at the table. I had built myself from white oak, the same table I had been eating at for 11 years. The grain of it runs left to right across the surface. I know every inch of that grain. I built it to last longer than I will. Outside, the ridge was dark. The cold front had come through and the air had the clean, empty quality it gets in winter. The sky very close and very clear. The stars hard and specific above the hills. I am 63 years old. I have work left to do, and I intend to do it. I have a daughter who may or may not find her way towards something truer than what she has been, and I intend to be there if she does. I have a shoebox on a closet shelf and 40 years of houses still standing across 3 Tennessee counties and a table made of white oak that will outlast the man who built it. And I have the knowledge, which no trust document and no letter and no dollar amount can fully contain, that someone who knew me well, who had every reason to overlook me and did so for years, finally looked again, saw what was there, chose to say so. That is not nothing. Whatever my daughter believed walking into that conference room, whatever calculation she had already made and settled in her mind, she was wrong about that part. That was never nothing.